I have the video on, so this is being recorded.
Whoa.
And the only people in frame are the ones on the panel, but your words will be heard. And I'm going to leave. There's a button on top to start and stop the recording. I should be back at the end of the panel.
Okay.
And if it stops showing the picture and someone can see it, just start it recording again, or Bjorn can text me.
So, welcome to HumInt, Human Intelligence in the 1632 universe. Let's start at the far end. And, please introduce yourself and tell us what you write.
I'm Gorg Huff. I write science fiction and fantasy and a lot in the 1632 universe. Miroslava Holmes is a private detective, and the Diogenes Club is Russia's new secret service. So, it's human intelligence.
My name's Marc Tyrrell. I write short stories in the 1632 universe, but I also have a background in real-life intelligence and the history of intelligence. So I've been working more and more of that into my writing.
I'm Virginia DeMarce. I've written quite a bit in the 1632 universe over the past 20 years or so. My best-known spies probably are Carlo and Paulo from the Unexpected Sales Reps and their adventures. However, I have thrown in bits of pieces of how it is really done here and there in other books, such as pointing out in one book that really the best place to discuss secret things is in a suburban family restaurant where everybody else is so interested in their own business that they will pay no attention to you whatsoever, and everybody in the intelligence community will think, or at least in the fictional intelligence community, will want you to be sneaking around the docks or something, whereas instead you are having fish for lunch while you discuss what is coming next. So that's the approach I take, the practical approach to finding what one really, or at least whoever commissioned one, needs to know.
My name is Bjorn Hasseler. I edit 1632 and Beyond and write Northstadters and Security Services, which is not really human intelligence, but I do write some library researchers who are. So, how much human intelligence is there going on in 1632?
By whom?
Yeah.
That is, are you talking about government-sponsored espionage, or certainly government-sponsored at the higher level of Francisco Nasi and his successors, or are you talking about the lesser level in which, for instance, with Paulo and Carlo, their main client is the Archbishop of Salzburg, who has his own interests and has specific things that he would really like for them to find out, rather than more general things. Are you talking about industrial espionage, which there should certainly be a great deal of? I've had some of that involved with the Lothlorien plants and the pharmaceuticals.
Let's talk about intelligence in 1630 before the Ring of Fire, because that conditions how it was practiced afterwards. In 1630, you had three main, we could call them intelligence agencies. You had one centered in Spain in Escorial, which had been around since about 1550, 1558. You had another one sponsored by the Council of Ten in Venice. And then you had the Countess of Taxis, Thurnan Taxis, who was taking over as postmistress, and she decided to enhance her income stream by opening letters, copying them, and putting them back together and sending them out. Then you had all the freelancers, and the Brits were very heavily into freelancing. France, they really couldn't have a central intelligence agency because they had too many factions. So, you know, you had Richelieu's network, which was very, very strong, but you also had the Rossignol family, which was not really affiliated with Richelieu. And then you had other ones. You had one down in Toulouse, I believe.
Yes, the Rohans ran their own.
The Rohans ran their own, yeah. You also, by 1630, had another one in Brussels, but it was concentrated primarily on industrial and mercantile intelligence. So that's the setup when the Ring of Fire happens. You've got a lot of freelancers running around. You've got very few state-level ones. And then you get the Ring of Fire and you get the semi-imposition of American ideas of intelligence going on. But that takes a lot of money to do. So again, what type of intelligence are you talking about?
All right, comment and question. There actually was already the Embassy Bureau, and it was
Yes.
a real intelligence organization in Russia, and it existed too. It wasn't as great, but it wasn't totally incompetent either. They actually did do some pretty good stuff before in the 1500s, early 1600s, and they needed the intelligence because of Sweden. And the other question though is, what about Spain? What about Spain and Portugal? What about their intelligence?
Spain had a really large actually it had two intelligence agencies, but nobody thinks of the Inquisition as an intelligence agency.
But it was.
It was, and so were the Jesuits.
And it was, yeah, and it was Spanish control. Yeah.
The Inquisition in Spain
The
was
Spanish,
controlled.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Very powerful. The key behind running a powerful intelligence agency is to create institutional memory, which means record keeping. So if you look at the Inquisition's files, they're incredibly detailed. I mean, they were so detailed that you can actually take the interview forms that were used and you can use them as actual interviews to create ethnographies if you want. That sort
When
of-
I wrote my part of the Bavarian crisis,
Mhm.
when I have that passage in which they are watching the Mary and her sisters go across, all of these reports coming into the Bavarian Central Intelligence Office, and they don't have enough personnel to read and coordinate.
Yeah.
And that was a constant in the period, namely that bureaucracies were, by modern standards, incredibly small. There were very few people employed by central governments, and they were constantly behind.
Well, the other thing running around, and it gets back to price, and I'm sure it was the same in the Russian Embassy Bureau, is paper is expensive.
yeah,
Paper is very expensive, and yet paper at the time was absolutely crucial to spycraft and intelligence operations, because it's not only about gathering intelligence, it's about manufacturing evidence.
right.
So if you look at all the operations against Mary Queen of Scots, you know, forgery was an absolutely crucial component of spycraft at the time. But that meant you had to match the paper. Oh, good grief.
Yeah.
And that can be a real problem. You had to match the ink. You had to match the cut on the quill. You had to match how the letter was folded. And there was a thing called letter locking. You run across that? Yeah. Imagine, if you will, a sheet that large where you cut out this isosceles triangle, and then when you fold it up, you thread that triangle through every part of the fold and then seal it. How are you going to open that letter without somebody knowing about it? It can be done, it was done, but it requires a lot of time, a lot of patience. And then you've got the codes, the ciphers, and all the rest of it.
And this is one of the reasons, I think, that Eric was always very vague about the technique that Nazi and his spies were using, because he really didn't want to go into explaining the technical details of how to do it. For much of espionage in this period involved opening people's mails, reading it, and sending it on again.
I wasn't writing a techno-thriller, okay?
Yeah, basically. And the files, to a great extent, still exist. You can use them and read them, and they're quite fascinating. So much of the Spanish files, though, were focused on the colonies, because the Spanish were so worried about keeping track and keeping control of the New World that they did not have time to focus on what was going on in the rest of Europe, other than the Netherlands, because really their money came from the colonies, and therefore their concern focused on the colonies.
You did find some focus on Milan as well, because it was one of the other few revenue-producing areas they had. But yeah, it's a real problem. But that gets us back down to a single question, which is all intelligence operations are de facto, okay, my boss wants what? Okay, it's probably going to cost this much to get it, so fork over the bucks right now. And they're expensive. And the further away they are, the more expensive they are.
Yes, and for freelancers like Carlo and Paulo, part of their dialogue in the early thing, they've been hired, and one of them is, actually gathering the intelligence and turning it in, and the other is expressing frankly his deep suspicion that once they turn it in, they're never going to get the second part of the payment. He'll just stiff them once they turn it in, which was a constant peril for the freelancers.
And not only was that a constant peril of the freelancers, you also found the other freelancers being jealous, so they might counterfeit stuff against them. You found this in England a lot. Submit that as evidence that this person is selling you out and trying to betray you, therefore we will arrest you and send you into prison for a while. Oh, but you're a really good cryptanalyst, so while you're in prison, we will send you a bunch of letters, and you've got 10 days to crack the code. Well, I don't have any of my papers. Tough, you got 10 days to crack the code. That's actually from a real case.
Some of the things we'll find in the files fall into the category of this can never work in fiction because fiction has to be plausible.
Yeah.
And the actual working of intelligence in the 16th and 17th century was rarely plausible.
Yeah.
It only could happen in real life.
It is now?
No. Well, don't forget that right now, one of the major components of almost every intelligence agency in the West is the narrative spin doctors who come out with stories about how it should operate, and oh no, that was a failure, but we're doing much better now. We've changed those procedures. You remember the Iran-Contra scandal? That's a good example of it.
We discussed how intelligence was gathered. Now let's talk about the effect of the Ring of Fire.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The first thing the Ring of Fire brings is an amazing ability to collect. They've got actual computers. In the Ring of Fire, they've got... Virginia, you were with us on the trip to on one of the trips to Grantville, where we brought in our educated guess about how many computers there were in Grantville, and got told no, there were about 10 times that many. And that was a fairly constant thing. There were actually quite a few computers. There were a lot of people who owned their own. There were computers in the school, there were computers in the library, there were computers in all the business offices, and you put those all together and you've got enough computers to where Grantville automatically becomes intelligence central for the world because of all the data going there, which means all the spies are going there, which means all they know is going there.
And this is why when they vote to change the capital of Thuringia Franconia to Bamberg, they still have to leave most of the intelligence gathering in Grantville because Grantville has the reliable electrical supply so that they don't surge their computers out.
Blow them up. Yeah.
Well, there's another reason too, which is that Grantville has basically a local internet.
Yeah.
Grantville also has encryption, PGP encryption
Yeah.
software for communicating. And because of the way a lot of intelligence operations worked that way, with independents, with some state level actors, you know, you may be an independent who's occasionally working for the French. I don't care. You feed me information from the French and you're trying to get information about the Russians. Well, I'll feed you the information I've got on the Russians. But I'm really working for the Duke of Braganza. So you get, it becomes Spy Central in part because the spies can trade information back and forth, which makes them look better.
I remember fairly early on we mentioned in one of the stories that there was a spy webpage, well, a spy bulletin board, that the spies would post everything in pretty good privacy, and there was just there. And anybody could look at it, anybody could download it, but unless you had the right PGP key, you couldn't read the messages. So that meant that the Russian spies could get information from, and the trade in information was money.
And Grantville speeded up the exchange.
Yeah.
Just
Dramatically.
dramatically. Otherwise, the mail systems were good.
Yeah.
Much better than most of the casual readers assumed they would have been. You could get mail from here to there in a reasonable period.
Couple weeks.
Or even less.
Yeah, depending on how far, yeah.
And the amount of banditry in the area.
Well, the Hanseatic League started post riders delivering mail in the 12th century, and by the time of Elizabeth, all of England had mail, and it expanded beyond governments. Individuals started using the mail during Elizabeth I, who died in 1603, I believe. So before that, there's mail systems working quite well, and a good example of it. So you don't underestimate what the mail was like. It was actually fairly elaborate.
The turn in Texas actually had their own security system for their routes. I mean, you could have bandits, but it wasn't a good idea to have bandits on a turn in Texas mail route.
They tended to hunt you down and kill you.
Yes, gruesomely.
And of course, that varied from time and place. In the wake of a major battle, you would have unrest and disorganization in the immediate countryside. Unless you had a lot of cascading catastrophes, they would regroup fairly quickly.
Plague being the major cascading.
Yes.
Yeah.
One would think, I don't know if there's any mention of train mail delivery, but there ought to have been in the writings. But one would have meant the early start of flying in the U.S. and around the world was mail delivery. The revenue for the early airlines was like Pan Am. They were delivering mail and making as much money off that as they were on new passengers on the planes. So one could imagine that the plane's early activities would have been mail. There might be some inferred things about packages going onto the planes. There's really no discussion of mail delivery being expedited.
Yeah, I think that, does Bamberg Airlines do a mail route?
They're specifically in
That-
air post.
Yeah.
Which story was it? The vice president's plane is down?
Right.
The plane had mail in it when it went down.
Right.
One of the anxieties was not only retrieving the vice president, but hoping that none of the locals had gotten to the mail before.
Well, what would happen, you would think, is as the spread out of wired communications, and spread out of trains and planes and the routes, you would think it'd be like a vacuum cleaner pulling and rerouting mail, because you could get it through the systems that were set up around the center of Europe now, spreading out from Granville, and messages could fly through that faster network at higher rates of speed. That would be a big...
Before the railroad, there are villages along it that are not regular stations who do the old, you flip the sign around to indicate, stop here for the mailbag.
The post
We've got
driver
something
stop.
for you today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about that is that it's going to severely degrade the use of the post offices as a form of intelligence gathering,
That's right.
which Thurn and Taxis were doing.
I would think that would also be a plus if you wanted to get a package
Well-
from one place
Well,
to the other
it's
without...
an interesting thing, because the cultural reaction in England, at least, to people opening mail was, that's a rape. It was really bad. They didn't like it at all. And most of the Americans don't seem to like the idea of opening mail randomly and constantly, but that was a standard practice at the time. So when you get the expansion through the railroads, when you get the expansion through the planes, you're going to have less chance to intercept that mail.
Yeah.
And that's going to have some very interesting longer-term effects.
Yeah, so this is a theoretical question. How are Thurn and Taxis going to react to Granville, then to the first airplane carrying mail?
They'll be wanting to buy an airplane.
They're gonna want their own airplanes.
Yeah, I mean,
And-
they
okay.
were a major commercial, they're still a major
They run-
commercial operation.
They run the German postal system.
Right.
Same thing
So
with
that-
the,
so we can
sewing
expect
machine.
You can
that
expect them
sometime
to
around
be grabbing
1633,
every single,
1634, Thurn and Taxis is looking to buy airplanes.
yeah, they're going to be grabbing every technical advantage that comes along as fast as they can get it.
Thurn and Taxis agents in Granville
Yep.
working on computers.
Yep.
You could imagine a young, down-time postal rider, a young man, maybe in his teens, growing up while this is happening, being in the mail delivery system and his experiences, and as he gets married and everything else. It could have a wonderful arc through all of the mess, telling a story like that. That could be really interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the use of the telegraph for message? Or does that fall more under signals intelligence?
Well, there's an interesting problem, which is signals intelligence technically is the interception of messages. So reading letters is actually signals intelligence.
Okay, I wasn't sure since that topic came up.
But yeah, it does get us into the more modern stuff. So it's very easy to hack into a telegraph line. You know, it's very easy to monitor radios.
It's easy to monitor semaphores.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
that's why you have codes.
Well, codes and ciphers. And one of the things that we do see as a result of the Ring of Fire is a very quick growth in sophistication on cipher systems.
One other thing that we should be aware of, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, is the difference between a cipher and a book code. You get a modern computer, you can have a book that is 10 gigabytes of random numbers, and then you go and there's no cracking that. It just doesn't happen, not even with supercomputers, much less anything they've got in Granville. So this is utterly, if you've got the book on both ends, and especially if you've got a computer that's doing the encoding. The decoding you don't really need one for, but
No 10 gigabytes.
Yeah,
Remember,
not 2000, 99, 2000.
10 megabytes
10
maybe,
megabytes.
but
actually,
not
10
10.
kilobytes is plenty for
Yeah.
some unbreakable code for all practical purposes.
So our cutting edge computers are Pentium 2s. There could
Yeah.
possibly be 1 or 2 Pentium 3s in town.
Right.
But as
If-
far
if
as
the-
really we've got
they bought them
into
the weekend before.
1637, 1638, only the highest levels are going to have access to that.
Yeah.
most of the people who want intelligence are still going to be using the traditional means because they can't afford access to computers.
Well, that's a little bit changed because of the aqualators.
Yes.
Yes, but even so, they're
They're not up to computer level, but.
the average, let's say,
Yeah, you're
if
right.
the city council of Ravensburg wants to know what the city council of Freiburg is doing in the matter of the salt price fixing, they're still going to be going at it the way they always did.
But you know, this gives a great opportunity for a story where you have a freelancer operating out of Granville who has managed to get a computer, and he's just selling to everyone, which, by the way, is what the Countess of Taxes was doing. She was selling to everyone.
Yeah, or just access to a computer. The Higgins Hotels has a dozen of them they rent.
Yep.
So,
How about somebody writing a code to crypt something on an actuator, and people buying the sales actuators supposedly going to businesses might be going to cryptography instead.
some of them are.
There's not a firm distinction there.
Well, it's very hard to write code on something with that kind of bit serial processing power. But there are, CRCs would probably be more than sufficient code for a message on even something as simple as a bit serial liquid computer.
Well, there's the question of how much code do you
Need.
for a particular purpose. Mary Simpson, when she writes to her son Tom on the front, basically uses a very simple code. It wouldn't be a problem for any expert to decipher it, but it was enough to frustrate the average postal clerk. That's all she needs for her purpose. And it probably frustrated a postal clerk when he realized that he had here a letter from Admiral Simpson, and it might wife and it might have some information in it, but no, he can't read it in the time he has before he has to fold it back up and get it to the mail back.
A limitation of the aqualators is the I/O. They don't have mechanical printers that, and all of the extras that we expect a standard computer to have.
Yeah.
So that means a person has to be there doing the manual input of whatever it is to get the water flowing and then reading the output.
You can do a mechanical output.
Yeah.
That basically the actuator switches, small switches, and it's not gonna be anything like, but you will be able to get something of a printer.
So that's one of the additional frictions.
Bells and
in
whistles.
using
Back in, the mid-'80s, I was temporarily out of academic work, but in need of money, and was working for NEC, which is a Japanese firm that did all sorts of interesting communications stuff. And they could, these guys who were in the office, do things like tweaking a bit with their fax machine and hooking it up to their old-fashioned rotator printer and get a printout out of the fax machine that went somewhere other than the fax was going. It was interesting to watch them manipulate the technology. So you're going to have really a whole continent full of people figuring out, how can we tweak this to make it do what we want it to do.
A printer was actually designed for the Babbage engine. And it was never built. And when they built the, because they only had a chunk of it in, it's in the Museum of Science and Industry in London. Then they commissioned for the 150th anniversary of Babbage, they built a complete Babbage engine #2, which was the design it was, and it, other than a few bugs in the design where
Yeah.
he got some gears turned over and a few minor things like that. And the
It
main
worked.
line was
It worked.
too much leverage. They had to put a 4-to-1 gear ratio in. But they wanted to get Bill Gates came to the museum to see it. I actually went, my wife and I went to see it as well. Bill Gates came to the museum and they hit him up for a donation for that, and he says, I got somebody for you. He put him in touch. Paul Allen came to him, who collects, and he commissioned, he says, I'll pay for your printer, but make 2 printers and another copy of that, and I'll pay for it all. So he got Babbage engine number 2, serial number 2, for his own personal collection. It was on display in the Science Museum, and it had the printer, and it could do logarithm tables and stuff like that. Babbage designed a mill machine. I have no idea what the Grantville Library or the Haas School would have, but somewhere they would describe geared computing systems. Somebody would have something about that.
Other people's money, one of the projects, and this wasn't me, this was somebody who wanted it in the story. Somebody had a little egg that was a little...
Oh, a Cura calculator. Yes, that was
Right.
an OPM.
And he wanted it in there, and so I had them look at it and say, okay, it's probably not, but as a doodad for rich people, we'll plate it in gold and sell, and they did. They're actually mentioned in a couple of other places, people actually having it.
Well, Babbage designed a general purpose machine, and the first programmer was Ida Lovelace, and
Yeah.
Ida programming language is named after the first programmer,
Yeah.
Ida Lovelace, and she was imagining programming this non-existent machine. But if any of that, someplace in the libraries or private collection, Ida and all this stuff exists prior to 2000.
Sure.
That information had to be someplace. So there's a story train of building mechanical machines, because they're not going to set up a semiconductor line.
You know, we're
anytime
really getting
soon.
here off onto highly technical
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas the basic question when it comes to human intelligence is, who wants to know it and why do they want to?
There you go.
So,
What do
but-
they want to know?
What do they want to know?
But the key phrase there, I think, was in the library. And there are a lot of people in and out of that library who start out with English class in the high school or in, adult ed at night, followed by the library class, followed by the citizenship class, or maybe citizenship and then library. And Rick Boatwright used to call that the espionage certificate.
I mean, just one little other point about Babbage, and it's not technical in the sense of computing. Before he got heavily into designing his computers, he actually wrote a book that was in response to Adolphe Quetelet's book earlier, and it was on the use of statistics to figure out exactly what is happening in populations. And this gets us back into human intelligence, because if you look at the earliest human intelligence systems, the Greeks, the Romans especially, it was all about how do peoples operate. And for most people who don't realize this, ethnography, which is the foundation of cultural anthropology, comes out of exactly the same stream, which is why anthropologists get into intel.
We touched earlier on one spy forging another spy, but in the books, early in one of them, I forget exactly which, we talk about misleading the Spanish about the swamps of Florida and why they should go find gold there.
Well, misinformation and disinformation are absolutely crucial components running around in there as well. And that's one of the areas where forgery becomes so crucial, because you could intercept a letter, and if you can get a perfect replica of the paper, the ink, the quill, the folds, the handwriting,
But if you intercept the originator, then it's even easier.
You don't necessarily
In
want
this
to
particular
intercept the
case,
originator.
The case,
Yeah.
of course, I would expect in a year or so, the librarian espionage experts would have discovered, no, Florida is not the source of gold.
Well, the paper back then, I mean, you could probably wash it and wash it. You could take the original, wash the information off it, and write new stuff on it. So it would be authentic.
Not that easy.
Not that easy.
On the other hand, I got, you're saying exactly
What's
right.
that?
You gotta get close, but
Spray paint.
Close enough to fool the recipient.
close enough to fool the
Yep.
recipient, and that's gonna depend a lot, we're back to human intelligence, on the recipient.
Yeah.
How well does he know?
Mhm.
Yeah, right, so, yeah. You had it.
Sort of the point is, the intelligence gets more computer dependent. 36, 37, 38, you start running into a problem I had with some of my early computers. What happens when your BIOS battery dies?
Yeah.
Yep.
They're gonna have to work on that, and the thing about it is, the BIOS battery is, the thing is, these devices, some of them, they have a projected lifespan. Some of them fail before that. Some of them fail around that time. Some of them don't fail for years more.
It's an average.
So you're gonna have a slow degradation of the number. But they're still gonna, it is a safe bet that there are still going to be computers, enough computers, well, not enough computers, but there are gonna be a significant number of computers in 1640 and
They're
1645.
going to start dying, they are.
You had another
And
question?
storage also.
Yeah.
Well, the first computer I bought in 1985 died in 2019. And that was a blazingly fast 8086, 8088 compact.
I replaced
The guy
at least
who
two
asked us,
BIOS
you had a
batteries
question?
before I finally gave up on my first one.
Sure, but then how long did,
Yeah.
at what point did the AST 6 pack that was in there that made it more useful die, and so it ceased to have 640K, it went back to 256.
It didn't. It was a power surge actually from a lightning strike that knocked it out.
Yeah.
Through two power surge.
But just additional points of failure is my point.
Yeah,
Well-
they're certainly going to lose electronics over time,
Very much.
but the spy community is just going to have to cope with that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, because a lot of the spy community didn't grow up with it, they're going to be keeping as many records as they can and hiding them against failure. Because they're going to be well aware that failures happen.
The man in the glasses. Yeah.
As far as the information, you've already mentioned the lack of personnel to get information processed correctly at this time. What was the professional level of their analysts, if any?
Cryptanalysts or general analysts?
General analysts, for instance, the infamous, gold mines in Florida, that information, if there had been sufficient analysts with access to other data, maybe they could have said, no, wait a minute, this is only coming from this one source.
But do they have access to other sources?
That's the problem.
And how long until they get?
Well, that only
More
Exactly,
works
and how long
because-
will it take for them to compare and contrast?
In Spain longer, but that's because of the perverse policies of the Spanish government that Eric put into canon. Basically, it's always a matter of how much you have as a frame of reference. Any analysis you do is only going to be, it's a garbage in, garbage out undertaking from the very beginning. So basically, if they never intended to fool Spain permanently, they hoped to divert them sufficiently long that they could get something else in underneath the,
Just a diversion of resources was all they were really after.
And that's a short time matter. If you want to look at and ask about analysts as trained professionals, probably the best group of those were the Jesuits. And they also had an extensive intelligence gathering operation going on. They had their own private postal system. They had their own codes.
The majority of the analysts at the time, as far as their professional education was concerned, had gone through the law schools.
Yep.
Okay, in Russia, it's the bureaucracy, and some of them were good, most of them weren't.
In Brussels, most of them were actually trained by the Jesuits and would usually apprentice in the merchant community because they were focusing so much in on, you know, industrial and mercantile stuff.
But
So I would.
in the German states, it was definitely the legally trained bureaucrats, and it was pretty much a matter of trial and error, picking out which of the guys who at some point were assigned to this actually turned out to be able to do it, in which case they continued, and the guys who turned out not to be very good at it were put into some other.
Well, honestly, that's the same today.
Yes.
It's exactly the same today.
Question?
So I was gonna ask you, photography is now in the canon, right? So small cameras for HumInt? No?
He's already got it.
What?
You had a thing with cameras.
I had a thing with cameras, but not small cameras. They're
What, photographic
They're
plates?
brownies.
Yeah, well, they're big
brownie
photographic
size,
plates
yeah.
right now.
Brownie size, but not the camera and the thing.
Well, there you go.
And you gotta develop the film.
But big photographic plates,
Yeah.
aerial photography
Yeah,
as
celluloid.
intellect.
Gosh, I
Does
don't
anybody
know if
have
that's
a
what
good, for other reasons, but included in this, does anybody have a good timeline for celluloid film?
34, I think, towards the end of it.
Yeah,
For movie camera film?
it's the follow-on story to The President's Plane is Down, where they're making the, what's essentially a James Bond film.
Okay.
On His Majesty's Secret
Yes.
Who's doing that?
Karen.
Yeah,
Okay.
but essentially it's the Swedish Black Regiment that's doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's one area I'd like to bring up that we haven't talked about, which was again a classical area for human intelligence, and that's assassination. It was used quite often, and if you look at least the records I've been able to find, assassination tended to be used more by the Catholic powers than by the Protestant powers. I don't know if that matches your own research in that.
Yeah,
but-
basically it was, but I'm not sure whether this was so much Catholic Protestant for ideological reasons as it was because it had been more, even in the 1300s and 1400s, more a cultural phenomenon of the Mediterranean area than of the parts of Europe that went Protestant later.
Yeah, that could be it. I haven't found a good explanation for it either.
You have Borgias and,
Well, yes, I mean, poison became a national pastime in different places. And there's some really fascinating examples of assassination techniques that were also part of the repertoire of professional spies at the time. Just out of interest, how many of you know that perfumers were considered to be poisoners?
Okay.
Okay, the distillation apparatus to make
Poison,
perfumes,
poison.
you could also distill poisons out of a number of things,
And drugs.
and drugs.
So you've got the same skill set that makes, I can't remember the nurse's name in Russia, the one who's basically running the.
Tammy,
Tammy Simmons something?
yeah, that's
Her staff is gonna be better poisoners than anybody else in Russia.
and it's because
Because
they've got
they're
the
making
training in
medicines.
distillations, yeah.
Yeah.
And,
That high school chem lab is gonna blow people's minds.
oh yeah,
That
yeah.
high school chem lab's gonna kill a lot of people too.
Well, the biology lab is where it's going to get really interesting when you get some downtimer who's involved or whose family is involved going, so when do we get to make Viper wine?
What's that?
We
Viper
do have
wine.
to stick within the parameters that Eric really didn't like assassination as a technique, and therefore he wanted to minimize it. You couldn't, one of the strictures we write under is that we can't have anybody prominent assassinated without Eric's
Permission.
permission.
And, yeah.
And he was even a little, not totally happy with the need to use the assassinations of Dreesen and Wiley, but he saw that it was, you know, a plot thing.
Well,
And
the other
per
thing is he
se,
was
they
much-
weren't important enough at the international level.
Yeah, that was part of it, but the other thing was, it backfired. That was Eric's big thing about assassination, the assumption that they always backfire. And they do when they're done publicly for political reasons, they almost always backfire. The secret assassinations where nobody knows who killed him, or even that he was killed, those can be quite effective political tools.
Well, actually, the assassination of Henry IV in France didn't backfire.
Okay.
It did start a de facto civil war between the Catholics and the Huguenots, but it wasn't necessarily a backfire, because it got rid of Henry, who was considered by the Catholic faction to be way too pro-Protestant.
Ah.
And even though he's officially converted.
Actually, considered by both the Protestants and the Catholics as being way too indifferent to religion.
Exactly, yeah.
And remember, Dreesen's assassination was by the Huguenots trying to pin it on Richelieu.
Right.
So basically it was,
Double blind blow.
yeah, and it sort of got the effect they wanted.
Except it got pinned on the
Yeah.
Jew haters and,
Yeah.
and the witch hunters.
And by one faction of the Huguenots.
Yeah.
An extremist faction of the Huguenot, yeah.
Yeah.
Of whom there were an ineffable number of factions. I mean, it was like Presbyterians in the United States. If you start looking at the variety of Presbyterians there are in the United States today.
Depends on how you count. Depends on how you count.
Yeah.
I mean, two Presbyterian churches in the same town could, you know,
They're different.
they got different ideas.
Yeah, but they're all classified as this kind of denomination, but what the individual subdivisions of the...
Sure, I always thought the United Methodist Church was kind of an oxymoron.
Yeah, how centralized is it?
Well, the thing is
That
that...
would make a great research project for an intelligence analyst.
Because as I understand it, from reading, most of the Protestants churches did not want it centralized because that was one of their complaints about the papists.
Well, the Lutherans tried to get one, and the Anglicans certainly got one.
Well, the Lutherans ended up being national churches, so there was no way to centralize them. There were Swedish Lutherans, there were Danish Lutherans, there were multiple varieties of German Lutherans, and there were Lutherans who dissented from any of the above. The Anglican Church ended up with its own panoply of dissenters that goes eventually all the way out to Quakers, you know, because basically a dissenter in England is not, we agree with the rest of the dissenters. It's mean we don't agree with the Anglican Church. We may not agree with it for 15 different reasons, and we may hate one another just as much as we hate them. I've been working with a woman who's interested in researching the surplus controversy.
While we're talking about the churches, at the end of the Besançon colloquy, what did Gustav arrange for everybody to take home with them?
Radios.
Radios. There is effectively a primitive internet of radios among notable clergy in Europe. And nobody's really explored what happens because of that. No longer are they required to write books against each other and then wait for the response and take some months to develop that. They can practically talk in person. And that's got some implications for espionage and for unity or disunity, depending on how you want to take it.
Especially when you're dealing with national churches. And Russia is a good example of a national church.
Yeah.
The Orthodox Church under the Ottomans is another good example.
Yeah, the thing about it is the Russian Orthodox Church was already starting its big schism, because the old guard Orthodox were still present. This is before Nikon went through and wiped out the old Orthodox church. So the Russian Orthodox Church at this time isn't unified. It was Nikon under Alexei the First, who basically did it.
Sorry, I got that wrong.
No, but all the keys for the big blow up were there. The difference is probably going to do with freedom of religion. Nikon can't do it this time, so the Orthodox Church in Russia is probably going to split into a bunch of different Orthodox churches.
Well, that will reduce the effect of the monasteries.
Yeah.
The political effect. That'll be interesting.
It'll disperse the effect of the monastery. Some will be this, some will be that.
So if we
Well,
can,
part of what we have to do is look at the reality of the way things were on the ground, as compared to how the casual uptimer knows of it. As Iona, the middle school music teacher who goes to work, teach at Quedlinburg, says to the abbess, "But I'm Lutheran, and I was taught that one of the things that Lutheranism did was it got rid of these corrupt archbishops." And the abbess of Quedlinburg says, "I'm sure Dr. Luther's intentions were of the best, but they didn't survive the reality of politics in Scandinavia and northern Germany." Because you still had politically appointed bishops with, and it was interesting in Lutheranism, so different from Anglicanism. Anglicanism had so many of its clergy come out of the gentry level, the equivalent of the lower nobility in the Germany. But in the Germanies, it was considered really déclassé for someone in that class to become a clergyman. So you had the high nobility still taking the archbishoprics and the high canonries, and then the ordinary clergy were
Peasants.
not peasants, but artisans, middle class. You sent the bright kid to school, and the clergy was a suitable option. But the lesser nobility, frequently, if an oddball decided he wanted to become a member of the clergy, his family would decide it really wasn't considered a suitable thing at all. And you have to, these cultural things don't go away right away. And this goes to the way intelligence is working too. It won't drop immediately. We've got to have a generation.
At least, if not more.
okay, we can continue this out in the seating area, but we do have to clear the room. We do have music in 1632 coming up at 8 o'clock. Also, Walter's book launch is at 8 o'clock for 1637, The French Correction.
And Eric Flint is at 3 o'clock in this
And
room.
Eric is at 3.